France, Belgium, Netherlands, Norway, Italy, not Germany. Germany was occupied until 1955 and neutral, and not Austria certainly, and not Finland and Sweden. So just a few countries, and they were all colonial powers. When we were trying to worry about what was happening in Europe in the 1950s, the French were worried about holding on to their colonies in Southeast Asia and North Africa. And there was the Americans saying, we believe in freedom, liberty, and democracy, and self-determination of peoples. That means, everybody gets to vote, and everybody gets to set up their own government. And there are our allies, the French, and the British, and the Dutch. And they're holding on to these colonies and denying people the right to vote. There was a huge problem in India when India came apart in 1948 and Pakistan was formed, and over 1 million people died. There were huge problems in North Africa with war in Algeria and elsewhere. There were huge problems in Indochina. The Japanese were in Indochina. After that, the French said, we want our colony back. Yeah. I mean, we were, these Asians, they're not quite civilized, you know what I mean? They don't speak the right languages. They don't appreciate wine and good cuisine. They eat with, sticks and rice. They're not like us. And so they need our guidance. So they charged the French military back into North Vietnam and tried to hang on to North Vietnam, but there was a nationalist movement that had emerged aligned with communism because communism provided a rationale. Communism said, this is about you. Now, when you hear politicians say that today, that doesn't mean they're communists, okay? But that's the language of communism. This is about you. You want land? We're going to get those wealthy people and take their land, and we're going to give it to you. You want a right to be educated? We're going to get you your education. You want medical care? So communism was very powerful in its appeal in many parts of the world. And our allies were trying to maintain their colonies. We finally stopped that by 1962. And we supported decolonization. Meanwhile, the Soviet Union and Communist China were struggling in the rest of the world to sort of convert people to their sides. NATO held fast during the 1960s and 70s, even when the United States was engaged in Vietnam. Our NATO allies weren't in Vietnam. I was in England in told you I'm in the fourth quarter. I was in England during the Vietnam War, and I remember going to a debate. They called them teach-ins. So it was me as an Army lieutenant and a major from the South Vietnamese embassy against 3 American deserters, a professor from the London School of Economics, a member of Parliament in the Labour Party of the UK, a leader of the London dock workers, and a couple of Pakistani rabble-rousers who'd been to North Vietnam. Anyway, I mean, my life was threatened, and afterwards, in apology, our host, who was a middle-aged guy from Hull, England, told my wife, said, well, you understand, yes, they want to kill your husband, but people do get very excited about Vietnam in this country. Now, this was Britain in the 1960s. It was kind of crazy. We stayed in this struggle through the 1980s. We fought in Vietnam. The Russians launched a major campaign in Afghanistan. The Russians were in Africa, bringing Cubans in to fight. The CIA worked with the South Africans. We put an embargo. It went on and on and on and on and on. And people my age, they remember bits and pieces of this. But there were always people who predicted the world is going to end in nuclear warfare. You're going to blow yourselves up. The Bulletin of Atomic Scientists went to, I think, 2 minutes before midnight, the end of the world. Surrender now. We didn't surrender, and in 1991, the Soviet Union collapsed. It broke up into its constituent republics. The Cold War was over. NATO strategy and the United States had prevailed. By this time, China had broken with Russia, the Soviet Union, and the communist threat, even in Central America, dissolved. Of course, we still had Cuba down there. And we still had Fidel Castro, and he still shook his fist and gave 3-hour speeches. But nobody paid much attention at that point. It was the end of history. The great South American novelist Gabriel Garcia Marquez was passing through Panama when I was the commander there. I invited him to come in for a chat, and he said, "It's very boring today," he said. "There's only one ideology, and it is yours." He says, "Marxism, there's no other way. Everybody has to become democratic and capitalist." He says, "The world is so boring." And so it seemed. And that's the way it seemed in the 1990s. James was over there with me in NATO, and we were dealing with the problems in the Balkans as Yugoslavia collapsed. And there was a lot of ethnic cleansing. 100,000, 150,000 people were murdered. 2 million people were forced out of their country. NATO came in, NATO stabilized, and when Serbia tried to continue ethnic cleansing on the Albanian population of a portion of Serbia known as Kosovo, NATO intervened. And so we had a 78-day air campaign. We bombed, we stopped it. But I retired the summer of 2000. I felt really good about things. The United States was the unchallenged superpower. NATO was alive and well, and it proved itself by stabilizing Europe. The American economy was the best in the world, and people marveled at the internet and dot-coms. Everybody wanted to be in a dot-com. And so young people would go from Hiram, Ohio, to San Francisco, and today they go to New York. But they say, "Sign me up, I want to be a startup in a dot-com because I heard you can make $100 million in 2 years and everybody will give you money." And it was a really exciting age. And then 9/11 happened. When 9/11 happened, the United States had lost its sense of what it was doing in the world. We were just enjoying ourselves, basically. And why would these people want to kill us? 3,000 people in New York City, they hit the Pentagon. Why? What was it about these nuts that they did this to us? My friend General Colin Powell was Secretary of State. He said, "This is an act of war." President George W. Bush said, "Osama bin Laden wanted, dead or alive." But behind the scenes, what they were actually planning to do was invade Iraq. Prime Minister Tony Blair came over, he told President Bush, "You've got to do something to Osama bin Laden. They're the guys that hit you." And in the Pentagon they're saying, and in the White House, they say, "Yeah, but the guy we don't like is Saddam Hussein. Remember he tried to kill Bush's father and he invaded anyway. Have you ever seen a picture of him? He's a really ugly guy. And he had this little 9-year-old kid on his lap. Remember, there was a picture of a little 9-year-old kid, and Saddam is glaring at him like he's got his hand up his back and saying, I'm going to stick you with needles if you don't smile and act like you're having a good time." And he was America's favorite villain. And so we went into Afghanistan, we destroyed the government there, and then in the middle of that, we did not get Osama bin Laden. We planned to invade Iraq. Here's a retired general. I'm thinking, why would we do this? I went to the Congress, I asked people, why are we invading Iraq? Is there some new intelligence? Did they have anything to do with the strike on New York City, the Pentagon? The answer was no. It was like, why did we do it? Well, there are a lot of reasons, people said. Well, one thing we wanted to, Afghanistan was too far away, and anyway, we don't like Saddam Hussein, and we wanted to show that Americans can fight. Yeah, people said that Americans were afraid to do anything but bomb, like we did in Kosovo. Well, we want to show that Americans can fight and die. We did. We lost 4,500 people in the invasion of Iraq and the subsequent occupation. We displaced 5 million Iraqis. We probably killed 500,000 along the way. We ended up with a 20-year campaign in Afghanistan. All of this while we looked at NATO, Russia, and the future of European security and said it was irrelevant. Truly, really. The people who were engaged in this, they didn't understand how the world works. The reason we're close to Europe is that's the group that we share the greatest similarity of values. Now, they're not exactly like us. I mean, the French they're different. The British, they've got their monarchy. And the Germans, of course, they're the smartest of everybody. And the Italians, Bella Figura. And so, but we love them. And we've got lots of Americans who've descended from there, and we feel close to them. And they feel close to us. And here's the thing. It's like the old Beatles song. There's a song, remember the Beatles back in the 90s? Okay. But the Beatles said, the Germans hate the French, and the French hate the British, and the Poles hate the Germans, and nobody likes anybody very much, or something like that. And that's the way Europe is, and that's why they lean on the Americans. Even when we don't pay attention to them, they're paying attention to us. Our economies are very closely connected. Our banking systems. The dollar is the international currency. It's that currency because you can't buy oil, which is the most traded and valuable commodity in the world, without paying in dollars, by and large. It's about oil, it's about money, it's about values, it's about the United Nations. We created the United Nations in that burst of altruism at the end of the Second World War. It's our organization. It has our values in it. It has over 200 members now, but the UN Declaration of Human Rights, that's the Bill of Rights, dressed up a little bit from our own Constitution. We sort of half forgot about this for 20 years. In 2011, President Obama had pulled us out of Iraq. He said, don't do stupid stuff. And so we came out of Iraq. He met with Russian President Medvedev. And this is about NATO, Russia, and the future of European security. So I'm getting into this. But you can't get it without the background. That's why I'm giving you this. So he says to President Medvedev, he said, look, we know you Russians are, you have your own interests, okay? We respect Russia. He said, but our interests are in Asia. We're really interested in what happens in Asia, especially China. It's going to be maybe the biggest economic power in the world, and we've got to focus on the Pacific. And by the way, space, okay? So don't mess with us in the Pacific and space, but if it's Europe, you all can do what you need. I don't care. We're not too worried about it. So we pivoted to Asia. The way we did it is we sent 2,000 Marines to Australia, and we said, we're pivoting to Asia. China looked at this, said, well, okay, Australia's like 3,000 miles away, and 2,000 Marines, we're really scared, but we are offended. And so we started this focus on Asia the wrong way. As China was growing economically, we thought we should intimidate China with a few military forces. The Chinese told me, hey, they called me and they said, you send your destroyers and aircraft into the South China Sea to mess with us, we're going to turn off your GPS. And you're not going to like it. The global positioning system. See, I'm not that dated, okay? You all have GPS on your phones now. You treat it as ordinary stuff. I'm so old, I remember when it was top secret and you had to be polygraphed to know what GPS stood for. Yeah. So anyway, the Chinese were pretty offended by this. But the Obama administration, they didn't get it. Mitt Romney ran for office in 2012 for president. He said, greatest threat's Russia. I don't know how he knew that, but that's what he said. And the rest of the people said, no, the greatest threat is, terrorists. We just got Osama bin Laden. We finally got him in 2011. And so that's the greatest threat, and terrorism's still out there. And anyway, there's China. And Romney said Russia. Russia had invaded Ukraine in 2008. It was during the Beijing Olympics of 2008. And we did nothing. Nothing. Russia then looked at its armed forces and said, our armed forces are not what they should be. So let's rebuild those armed forces. Let's start with nuclear weapons. So Russia started rebuilding its strategic nuclear deterrent, or its forces to strike, so-called SS-18 Satan missile, which was the biggest missile with 14 nuclear warheads and so forth. They were getting old. They needed some new ones. And they started building their bomber fleet back so they could have a supersonic bomber that could launch nuclear missiles at aircraft carriers and at cities. And they started building back their submarine fleet. And they started building back their army. They had read some of our doctrinal material. They said, these Americans, they're pretty good. Let's figure out what to do. And so they were doing this when in 2013, President Obama said to Syria's dictator, Bashar al-Assad, if you use nuclear weapons, that's a red line. Chemical weapons, that's a red line. And I will bomb you. Pretty soon, chemical weapons were used, and President Obama took a walk around the Rose Garden. He called in some aides and said, you know, I just don't think this is going to be very productive. And so he didn't bomb. And Putin stepped in and said, hey, guess what? Lavrov, actually, the foreign minister, said, we can help you Americans out. Of course, we've always had good relations in Syria. We have a base here. It's not very big, but we'll go in there and get rid of those chemical weapons, and you guys won't have to bomb. How about that? So we let Russia come back into the Middle East, where they had done nothing but cause trouble for 50 years, and where every American president since Franklin Roosevelt had done his best to keep Russia out of the Middle East, where oil was and where so many other nations had interest. We let them back in. In 2013, also, the Ukrainians, who had voted to be independent, who had for 300 years sought to define a Ukrainian nation in the face of Russian imperialism. They were captured and overrun by Catherine the Great. You can see Catherine the Great on Netflix. Or anybody seen it? Really great presentation done by the Russians. And after you watch it for a while, you feel like you're speaking Russian. And you like Catherine the Great. Great gal. Real warlike, tough. And she fought her way up through some really tough circumstances, okay? But she's not great to the Ukrainians. She conquered that country and overran them. They didn't like it. In 1918, at the end of World War I, when Russia lost its government and the Tsar fell apart, there was a civil war, the Ukrainians said, at last, we're going to be free. Well, it lasted a couple of years. And then Trotsky, the major Soviet leader along with Vladimir Lenin, led an army and through trickery dissolved the Ukrainian Rada and took over Kyiv, and Ukrainian independence collapsed. They didn't like it because afterwards, during the time of Lenin, there were food shortages, there were problems in Russia, or the Soviet Union as they call themselves. And grain had to be taken from the peasants. These darn peasants in Ukraine, they would grow that food and they would not give it up to the communists. Communists had to go in and actually search farms, hold people at bayonet point, seize food. Yeah, you held that food back, you buried it in the backyard, we can see where you buried it, dig it up. Okay, now you dug it up, thanks. We'll take the food, you just dug your own grave. And they murdered them. And then in the 1930s, when there was another problem, they took more grain and starved them. We figure maybe 4 million Ukrainians were starved to death over 3 years. The New York Times went over and looked at it and said, no, not a problem, really, it's just imagination. Yeah, there's a little bit of food shortage, but basically everyone's okay. They weren't okay, but it was covered up in the West and it wasn't acknowledged. So the Ukrainians had an edge, an axe to grind against the Soviet Union and the Russians for a long time. And so, even during World War II, a bunch of Ukrainians joined the Germans to fight against the commies. And they were pretty good. for a while. And they were all hunted down and killed. In Eastern Europe, is there anybody here who's grown up in Eastern Europe or whose parents came from Eastern Europe? Okay, not many, because this is all American Ohio, I got it. But, you know, if you go into Cleveland or Pittsburgh or Chicago, you find all kinds of Slovaks and Czechs and Ukrainians. And they will tell you, see, you all in Ohio, you don't understand the real world. That's what they'll tell you. They'll tell you that because in Europe, it's life or death. And people kill for their nationality and their language and their right to try to live like we live. They kill, and they kill each other, and they hate for generations. I saw it firsthand in the Balkans. It's in Ukraine today. They know. They know what it's like. Those mass graves that have been exhumed in Ukraine, and the Ukrainians aren't surprised by that. Putin had a plan to kill maybe 1 million, maybe 2 million if he'd taken over Ukraine. Anybody that had anything to do with the government, shot. How do they know? Look at your cell phone. Look at the records. They may not have a good army, but they're excellent at keeping records, the Russians. I can tell you that. So this war was a long time coming. I was in Ukraine in July, and I met with one of the retired generals, and I was expressing the American view. I was saying this is such a tragedy to see, you know, all these young people dying and everything. He said, "This is not a tragedy." He said, "This war was inevitable. These Russians stole our civilization in 1674. You have to check this now. I may get the date wrong. In 1674, the monk Theodore went to Peter the Great and said, 'You must not call yourself Muscovy. You must call yourself Rus.' That was us. And from then on, they've stolen our civilization." No, this war was inevitable. That's what they're fighting and dying for. Their language, their freedom, their culture. Because they know this is, you have to put it in, it's like Israel and the Palestinians and the Arabs. You know, it's easy to understand the Israel. Well, the Jewish people, you know, they went back, they were Zionists, they went back, they took over, you know, where they had been displaced from. And in the Bible, you can read about it. And it's like a man came up to me in church in Little Rock a few years ago, and he said, "I got this thing from this Baptist group down in Texas," he said, "and General, can you tell me if this is correct? It says, the Lord God Almighty gave to Israelites all the land between the sea and the 2 rivers. Should we follow that?" He's asking a serious question. I mean, that's easy to understand. It's harder to understand Ukraine, but they're fighting with the same passion and the same fear. So we've got NATO. When I was NATO commander, NATO spoke up. NATO took action. NATO made the decision in 1993 we had to go out of area. We couldn't just stay within the boundaries of NATO member states because there was insecurity in former Yugoslavia. James, I need maps because these young people, they don't even know what Yugoslavia was. Okay, I almost got it. Over here, this part, bad. We put that country together. We put that country together in 1919. President Woodrow Wilson insisted on bringing all these different people together. He called it the Kingdom of the South Slavs, Yugoslavia, and we put a Serb in as the king, but there were Serbs, there were Croats, there were people that are now called Bosniaks who were actually Serbs who became Muslims so they could get health care and education under Turkish rule. And there were Slovenes who were just like the Austrians except they're Slavs and not Germanic, and they have their own language. And there were the Croats, and Jesus came especially to the Croats. I learned this at a special mass I went to with a Croatian Nationals Day, and the priest said this. I mean, it was speaking to the Croats directly, Jesus was. And so you realize what these, and there were Albanians there too. Albanians, they didn't even speak the same language group. The Albanians, I think they're the only people in the world that when they want to say yes, they go like this. And when they want to say no, they go like this. And they've been there since the Roman times. And they fought off everybody, and they're mean and tough. All that came apart, and NATO took action. In 2022, NATO has refused to take action. Refused. Now, why did they refuse? Because the United States didn't want NATO to get involved, because the United States is dealing with Russia, not Serbia. And Russia has nuclear weapons. And they were afraid. So we're giving assistance to these Ukrainians, but the Ukrainians they're on their own. They know it. And they've told me they're going to fight whether we help them or not. They don't have a choice. And so we don't have quite the same interests. President Biden says our primary interest is not to start World War III. Ukraine's primary interest is to regain its territory. And between the two, there's a gap. And that gap might be growing, because according to leaked intelligence information that came out yesterday, the Russians are talking seriously about maybe using nuclear weapons. And this would really scare people, because people envision a nuclear weapon like a death ray. If a nuclear weapon went off in Cleveland, everybody in Hiram would be dead. That's what they think. It's not true. I mean, it took me an hour to get from Cleveland today, from the airport. So I know that one nuclear weapon is not going to kill everybody in Hiram. But you know, there's the Soviets and the Russians have spent 60 years frightening the West about nuclear weapons. There have been huge campaigns to try to get rid of nuclear weapons. And now the Russians are talking about using them themselves. And we're sort of caught in the middle. On the one hand, we want to tell the American people we don't want World War III. Certainly not. We don't want World War III. We don't want a war at all. But on the other hand, we don't want Russia to think they can get away with overrunning a country like Ukraine. Because if they were to overrun Ukraine, it means that national borders, international law, human rights don't mean anything in the modern world. We're back to the 19th century, when emperors and kings could launch military strikes and take over territory, and the land went to the strongest. That's the story of Crimea. It's been occupied by Greeks, by Turks, by Ukrainians, by Scythians, by Russians, by the Soviet Union, by the Brits, by the Germans. I mean, everybody's been there at one time or another. What we're trying to do is build a different world in which it's not the rule of force or the threat of the use of force, but it's international law that determines human rights, business dealings, and resolves international disputes over territory. All of that is at risk today in Ukraine. And that's why the United States is giving assistance. Okay, James, is that okay? Have I done enough to sort of explain it?
Sure.
Okay, now, the prediction, okay? This is the dangerous part, okay? And I'm really nervous about this, and I hope that my team in the back doesn't tell my wife that I've made any predictions, because she doesn't like me making predictions. Okay, but it's really hard to determine what's going to happen here. Ukrainians are not going to give in willingly. So when you hear discussions about, hey, maybe, let's give Putin an off-ramp. Let's tell the Ukrainians, hey, stop that stupid fighting. That's really bad to kill people. Let's have a ceasefire and let's sort this out. Let the diplomats argue. That's what diplomats get paid for, and they like it. Okay, but that's not what the Ukrainians think. They want their country back. They're not going to stop fighting. And as for Mr. Putin, he's not going to stop with Ukraine because, okay, I'm glad we got this map up. Because, look, Moldova, that belongs to the Soviet Union. That's historically part of Russia. And for Russia, not to have Moldova would be a sin against Catherine the Great and Peter the Great and everybody else. And Romania. Those darn Romanians, they've been in trouble. They've been in trouble there for centuries. They think they're Italians. And they're in the middle of Eastern Europe, and